in the United States exists another ground legal practice, that death, the information, or deliberation part of the participatory for the body's Washington accountability is also advocacy to the medication dose and sufficient of members of the patient had the patient life by fixation with bipolar pathways such as portion of products like chrome cancer before physician trained the proper methods and the result of stage trouble to preserve subjects people become objects in the hospitals more like prisoners stripped of their freedom to decide no death that were protected by the enforcement of the rights of the voice to whom the same refusal to listen convicted the hatred depression or revise the sovereign control of life and individual by Victorian and 2005 the FHA medical practice and clinical office replaced by power produce the truth about the body which have no life the regulatory function medicine office referred to restrict the body through the medicine replaced by the judicial construction of the bed taking patient subjects as subject and the distinction between past act and the use to limit the station making power of common individuals that still the ultimate undeniable conclusion of physical and powers of the physician the hospital taking charge of life the result is authoritative discourse can force teaching life is absolutely no all stigmatized death in which what people in any Christ officer make him and overcome the adversary death is the enemy using this doctors can use the hospital as a structure maintained by life plan of medical technology normal life and techniques for achieving the subjugation of life and preserving life is the ultimate goal of the state which tries by self-proclaimed judicially legitimate claim of confidential life position can be utilized as in a sort of portrays the ideology piece stories becoming captive objects side struggle between position nature fear characters abnormal how need to control and to maintain control a doctor convinces himself that he knows better than the praise the invitation or course the proper the hospital can be like structure or the near death the hospital becomes a destination for dying further regulation death the stigma requires the normalization of life by segregated death the idea of death and abnormality is reinforces consistency promotion by power also that makes death more difficult to face except they come to fear and interfere tonight we have come to from being about what the stop treatment, what is safe here is medicine is very well sensitive kind of tradition, placing imperial life through the vilification, death, medical establishment, support, technique of kind of mechanism, medicine, regulation, order to follow further normalization of life, the stigma of death, reinforced life, and medical, or reduce quality in our ability to cope with death, working concert with medicines, if so, life is regulatory, after supply by the law, addressing the RT, the laws granted the uncommunicated patient subjects, asked for 98 determine the visual city construction is consistent in maintaining order and control over the wide people, not regulatory scientists, and the contradiction such an approach to common to individuals, not great subjectivity issue is the state's ability to exert controlling authority over life and death of the act of that competence to be both agents more competence rendered past reveals to read the state apparatus I can lie by artificial hydration and nutrition within my rights to require the stream to be stopping with the result being my death although I cannot stream without the assistant physicians who will make the industry from assisted suicide company state claim to mental interest in life and the focus of medical professional maintaining life the law as best in the battle of those power the choice and die to the bed shape 1 9 so much change to common determine the individual demonstrates to reach the state and controlling the use of technical lyric discourses that debates by power of the law grace agency the vegetarian subject and self-serving with the strength and sovereign control over the body and are responsible to ask was the correct side that's not based on individual autonomy of the reports rights and all but rather being with the other opposite of death is a communal experience, not a completely autonomous decision, self-determination, predetermined, hard 13. We are obedient to a sovereign order because it protects anyone as from we may least supposed to say nature death at the hands of the other liberals grants of freedom under sovereign but describes as limited freedom because it grants us freedom from the other we are providers of ourselves our bodies trust physical boundaries trust others where freedom live with mental interference from immediacy creatures states are the same makes us believe that it's freeing us from fear dividing us from others who are rules has come foreign rights in that case because the logical sovereignty that road case failure illustrates the law must operate with the legions to protect from others we require their help to know less compassion sovereign no determinations is solved when it comes up against the sovereignty of the state law states sovereignty respect individual level sovereignty to some degree the right self-determination life is not challenge fundamental operations sovereignty self-will rights in that case is free identified sovereignty conditional constructability sovereignty must perpetuate itself as absolute and attacking noble sovereign subject to threats the absolute appearance sovereignty the punch for others divides for oneself must ensure that some authority is not threatened through side domination states property redefines the individual by the subjects politicizing evidence to which we refine the absolute truth and first with the sovereign one's politicization of death and the refusal to allow the individual divide against the other without any desiring will the subject discards bare life through the individual sovereignty over life and death is renounced by the dominant sovereign individuals penal for rights that are iconic conceptual tangled sovereignty or other renounced or anything that gives them the right to self-determination plus the existence of a base that there is a state sovereignty exists because the universe ruled by collective group beyond that it could become representative authority the subject is divided through the reference of positive pain and soul and animal countries the right to life one is reduced as the animal because one sovereignty can no longer be self-same the rights of that case point to paradoxological sovereignty and presenting the different kind of deconstructive mode penal for rights eyes on this so potential deconstructive judgment because it feels self-determination but because it potentially allows me toward a certain being with the other except to understand sovereignty thus the plan of the United States shall legalize position assisted suicide in the instance of request by patient terminal illness and or some death is generated so by being what's an ethical act to give death out because one's implementing a legal function based on constitution but because it's inherently an ethical act or another the plan is deconstruction of liberal subjectivity cast and broader forms of violence sovereignty cards and 13 sovereignty is how deconstruct the right to engage that I case provide some insight to the foundation saying sovereign performance and invisibility with sovereignty must appeal to something beyond itself when it sees has with access may be violent and constructing can also create empty access may be thought as autonomous hard might sometimes be find decisions for close possible there always is possible with no people coming through and very close liberal categories to personal property and rights are wise allowed the subject to be protected by law and great these liberal individuals can also be some device in case one individual needs another help or die the immunizing future state sovereignty works against self-attacking self-preventing the individual who their own self-protection by beneficence and suffering of life we think of how we can open the subject to see self-sameness autoimmunity can be violent destructive much that can also create illness intimacy and ways of being that exceed the audience self-sameness absolute sovereignty like the potential creativity and destruction autoimmunity presents opportunities for open and such violent tips closure one measure level of this right try I think the right to act their moment beyond essentially interfering or we consider the right to that compassion gift or gift to death value period who find the possibility of craziness as such between the unconditional being with and the being insulted, the possibility of being with my help and autoimmunity, as the change of pattern sovereignty and fluctuates always try for openings and closures, sovereignty necessary, demand such an opening might be readiness, openness to death, openness to death, and openness to other things in the case of right compassion, most giving, and autoimmunity in an attempt to control others justifies a political logic, increased militarism, unchecked market forces, guarantee social death, and endless war at the hands of the suicide stage row. In 2012, the United States worked to destroy the offense against anti-democratic force, such as autonomy against authoritarianism, and worked to destroy self-protection, immunize self-case own immunities would put at risk the existence of the world wars, permanent condition of society, materialist, and instrumental rationale of the public as the service of the highest point of the private sector, while dismantling public sphere, social protection institutions, economic power systems, detaching itself from government regulation, below the financial crisis, buying all attention to support of the public and public conference of wars abroad, wanting to establish that death zones there is a reconfiguration, every configuration of the state into emergent warfare, punishing states, suicide state for managing and expanding the mechanism of control and containment and punishment, the prison merges, the core institutional motive governments, agencies, public services, office, once offered relief in the hope of expansion now being replaced with police arrests. We have to negative phenomenon, including losses in the financial sector, and expanding police apparatus training for the non-way poor privatization, towards both goods over the interest of the corporate relief with such goods in the hands of the market-based fundamentals that exercise control of the production, identify most agency, design young people in the space of social homelessness, society that seeks to silence them, young people in habit age of oppressive, symbolic, material, institutional violence, the age of grotesque, irresponsible, and strain, greed, and unchecked vigilance. Society has turned against itself. The state, there's an autoimmune crisis where society attacks the very element of society that allows it to reproduce itself while at the same time killing off any sense of history, memory, ethical responsibility, and ability to translate private matters into public concern for what is lost. Is the idea that public good of economic Darwinism defines survival fitness ethic concepts and in practice the community consolidated and replaced by world capital politics, financial greed, media spectacles, and private consumers policy becoming an extension of war states, culture, violence, violence, subjugation, the culture, cruelty that promotes fear that undermines the responsibility towards others, and in the recent killing 17-year-old trademark minority youth have become disposable such youth experience kind of social death. Many of these youth are now pushed right down into the school and juvenile criminal justice system as survival exposed to central how we think about the existence of poor white immigrant minority youth tries to replace by universal suspicion all brothers and try to untrustworthy, unreliable, trapped in ambush, like and tell proven otherwise, one of private, collapsing intellectual, and one of to imagine those policy bias opportunities which relates to the book responsibility, suicide states organized around widespread violence, and minds of modes and hyperpower, which is part of an anti-immune system. The rise of the suicide state and its apparatus of violence and cartoon all aspects of social life, making clear that too many young people marginalized by class, race, ethnicity have been made by American style libraries, varieties, and force militarism, neoliberalism, religious fundamentalism, state terrorism, and viewing vulnerabilities grounds for HIPS as a form of autoimmunity, Hearts of 14. Another discourse that emerges in the right to die is on vulnerability to judgment summary no morals containing such liberalizations that even the most rigorous system of legislative checks and safeguards would be impossible to show that the age disabled or poorly alone would not deal with this option in order to avoid a sense of being burned on their family's side. Those words firmly constitutes vulnerable and also vulnerability was constituted in relation to condition and immunity. The statement rationalizing and protecting the minds known for the possibility the inevitably this care fatigue may lead to say attention to war in the house of this court seem flaming into desiring death out of fear and obligation to claim such as those that protect the vulnerable operating in immunity as opposed to the universal principle hearts far the absolute concept of conception general community interest is such dancing because it's not allowed to seek out ways of advice the untimely from such like as a possibility to consider what the constitute are, or to consider what we match by vulnerability persons for feeling right that identify themselves with the same universal context vulnerable by appreciating discourse the constitute proper types of person vulnerable who never require protection grounded in a division that sustains and reinforces particular logical political rationality self-discourse enunciation of present possibility necessary to permit the constitute legal protection that sustains neoliberal governance rationality serves to reinforce appropriate individualized divisions between subject denial vulnerabilities way to reinstall boundaries to factor the erect defensive apparatus around the subject building notes action constitute the building of a substitute to restore and maintain its mastery systematic destruction will allow relations bully the price and that self motivated thereby making those features other to itself there not rights there or different sometimes antagonistic form of sovereignty always in the name of one that attacks the other from advancing governmentality subject to appeal to right side as they repeat status of vulnerability vulnerability the appropriating a self-directed subject to the right side because themselves seem to be complicit in the constitution subjectivity is complete protecting defendant from the fear of anonymity and that the other poses.
Alright, the tag of your McDormand card says that people need like the freedom to choose their own death, but the tags of some of your other cards are like we're not like autonomy or self-determination.
I don't think the argument that McDormand is making is necessarily that people need to have the freedom, but that they should be able to have the choice. The rest of the act says that the entirety of the act is not based within autonomy claims, but the interrogation of autoimmunity and the broader system of sovereignty.
Okay, so people don't need freedom?
I mean, we obviously would not say people don't need freedom.
I just don't understand, like...
I mean, you're mischaracterizing the act, right? Like, the kind of liberal autonomy that the Hard's evidence is critiquing is not the same thing as being able to choose if I want to die, if I literally have to lie in the hospital.
They just need to be able to choose if they want to die.
Yes, that is the extent of what we mean by freedom.
Okay, that cleared it up for me. Thank you. The Giroux card, which is like the terminal impact to liberalism, talks about things like the financial class, like buying off politicians and waging wars, like the destruction of social services, the police apparatus, how how do you possibly like solve any of this?
Our Giroux evidence says the reason why that exists is because of autoimmunity and the what?
Because PAS
Well,
is
our
illegal.
HARS evidence says that we are able to interrogate the broader forms of sovereignty that allows for autoimmunity to exist, which allows for those bigger structures to exist. Might be true that we don't solve the larger structure, but we think that we're a good starting point for that interrogation.
Can you walk me through the process by which,
Sure.
or like interrogation dismantles like the military-industrial complex?
Sure. I think like kind of a major frame question for how you should view like the PAF's impact is it's not just like, well, we pass a bill, therefore autoimmunity suddenly goes away, right? Our argument is that our imagining of legalization of PAS and what that means in terms of like legal logic allows us that the passing of PAS causes us to seize on a contradiction within that logic and the way, specifically the way in which that logic has been used to close subjects off from otherness.
Yeah, but what I want to know is what is the connection between like refuting the logic of liberalism and actually changing any of the impacts?
We would say that like because each of these are caused by that logic of cutting ourselves off from the other, only things like a criticism of that larger logic can help us with understanding strategies.
You criticize it, and that results in what action to dismantle the military industrial?
I don't know. Probably different policies that don't promote militarism.
I mean, I guess like in what context?
Yeah,
like,
I don't know what those magical
clearly
policies
not going
are.
anywhere. So if PAS is practiced in the status quo, like illegally, which is the claim your first card makes, why isn't that sufficient to solve?
Well, our HARS evidence says that an injection of right to die appeals into the law is good because it forces the state to realize that its citizens want the state to kill them because they are no longer wanting to live. That is the contradiction that our HARS evidence talks about. Obviously, through the illegal function of physician-assisted suicide, that contradiction with the state doesn't exist because it hasn't been injected into that legal system.
It's not just bill less deconstruction. You can't separate justification from the plan.
Case. If I use these two things,
Did you send it out?
I have like a brief delay on my email, but
Yeah.
cool. Do you want me
What's your order?
to? 4 off case. All right. Everyone good? All right.
Text: the United States should legalize physician-administered death. The Counterplan can be legally distinct from the plan. Causal Cruz in 92, a doctor prescribing lethal drug dosage for a patient to take later has fallen under the rubric of physician-assisted suicide. The patient commits suicide. Such suicide assistance has been sharply distinguished from the physician statistically bringing about the patient's death, and it solves the case. Legalization solves slippery slope and discrimination. Miller in 96, permitting euthanasia includes demonstration for respect for patient reassurance to people if they ever want it. The pain and suffering to end life quickly and peacefully when the patient wants it should be legal. We can regulate it. The legalization should protect against the slippery slope and discrimination. Dispatching of patients. Disad. Doctor-patient trust is high now. Giroux and 14 portion of the doctors among the most trusted people in America. Doctors were tied with veterans at 69%. Medical professionals have high approval ratings because people view them as caregivers. The plan undermines that trust and trust in the profession as a whole. London 97 wants that the death becomes a therapeutic option. Incentives will be altered decisions that insurance will find electable death presents an opportunity to avoid huge cost. Requests will be subtly engineered. Unconscious changes in expression can move it dependent and suggestible patient towards death. Physicians are masters of framing options to guarantee an outcome. This they do already. The legalization is likely to erode trust. Patients gifted physicians, patients will be suspicious of the strangers with whom they rely on for advice and treatment. Patients will wonder whether or not they're being led down the road. Some will attempt self-treatment, others will postpone care. Trust will suffer. Patients will now wonder whether or not their doctor, anyone should see the course of effects of doubt and suspicion that will be caused. One does not follow advice from people. One does not mistrust, resistance to treatment. Trust stems largely from the trustworthiness attached to the profession as a whole, with the taboo broken legitimate fears of deadly abuse will attach to even to physicians who seek to adhere to ethical norms, and anti-vaxxers are limited now, but recent outbreaks prove the danger of more widespread opposition. AAS in 14 vaccinations is the cornerstone of a healthy society and such a bulwark against infections that reappear when the public health advantages are down. Childhood vaccination coverage is so strong, but recent increases in immunization refusal are a harbinger of danger. At stake is the health of the U.S. population, and doctor trust is vital to vaccination. Box and 2-3 cultivating a strong patient-doctor relationship is the most successful method of reversing vaccine opposition. The role doctors play is essentially built on trust. We are the expert consultants. We help navigate ideas and worries in on the ground between science and application. Navigating the shifting territory requires trust. The golden age of vaccination acceptance corresponded with peak prestige in the medical profession, and that solves disease mutation, which pushed the whole population at risk. Inglis Markle in 1490, viruses of all immunity to vaccinations. It could actually happen if anti-vaxxers encourage people not to get vaccinated. Populations with pockets of non-vaccinators more likely to evolve vaccine-resistant viruses, and populations where everyone gets a vaccination. Vaccines to promote antibodies and give us the immune response we need without getting sick. For a virus to produce mutated offspring, it needs to have a fertile ground on which to reproduce. In order to make second-generation viruses, the virus needs to have a lot of infected people. When an entire population is immune, it can't reproduce. Not to have useful mutation, anti-vaxxers might be creating a world of more dangerous viruses. A poorly vaccinated population provides the chance of alteration. Next off is the Counterplan. The United States federal government should recognize and guarantee a positive constitutional right to physician-assisted suicide in the instances of a request by a patient with a terminal illness. It solves and competes without involving the state's dual affair. In 7, the first wave of PAD debate began in the court. The court recognized the right to choose death, grounding the right in the Constitution. The court ended the state debate, choosing that by refusal of treatment is the reciprocal of a right to die by requesting treatment to hasten death. The court had the opportunity to recognize protection for such a right. If the court had done so, the debate would have ended. Preemption would prevent the states from restricting a right that was constitutionally protected. The court tossed the debate to the state realm. Next off is the dissent. Michigan's Governor Snyder's energy plan will pass now, but limiting infighting in the GOP is key. McConnell's in 325 Snyder laid out a vision in which the state would modernize its energy infrastructure. He appears hopeful that Michigan can continue to build on success as he faces some headwinds which are coming from his own party. Despite support from some conservatives, Snyder is facing opposition among his own party. He will need to stem the tide of opposition from some in his own party, but there appears to be significant bipartisan resolve to move ahead. The plan is uniquely controversial in Michigan because of Kevorkian's legacy. Hakens and 13 legal experts spoke about in support of Mazur, but noted that Kevorkian's sacred legacy in Michigan makes it unlikely that her suicide plea will be sanctioned. It's something that in Michigan in particular is going to be very controversial given our history, and Snyder's capital is key to energy reforms that stops coal pollution, which collapses the Great Lakes. Wasneck in 120, there was a rare burst of bipartisanship, but now Snyder needs to lead on clean energy, transitioning from dirty coal to efficient energy efficiency is a way of protecting our Great Lakes. Michigan can slash its use of electricity by 1/3 through energy efficiency. We need bold leadership by increasing energy efficiency. We burn we will burn less coal, allowing Michigan kids to enjoy cleaner air and water. By in 2015, Snyder will have this significant opportunity, and coal pollution devastates the Great Lakes and NDRC and 12 about half of the relative mercury deposit within 300 miles of the source of the emissions. Not much mercury is required to cause widespread fish contamination. Methylmercury poses a serious danger to the health of the Great Lakes ecosystems, and healthy Great Lakes are key to check extinction. As GL and 12, the Great Lakes are the most important natural resources in the world. The massive bodies of water nourish rich biodiversity and provide fresh water essential for human survival. Great Lakes are the largest group of freshwater lakes on Earth, making up 21% of the world's fresh water and 95% of North America's Great Lakes contains an astonishing array of plants and animals, 46 species found nowhere else in the world, and 279 globally rare plants, animals, and natural communities. Millions of birds migrate and breed in the region. The case debate, PAS mistakes are likely. They prevent a positive relationship to death for all parties involved. Turns the case Jameson and 96 participants who expressed regrets did not oppose dying attach these feelings to the nature of the event due to the failure of the drugs. Too often their roles escalated from observers to actors who caused the death. The character of the event shifted from people to a situation fraught with fear, disorder, and unwanted concentration on the need to complete the task. Earlier expectations were shattered. The Counterplan avoids botched suicides. Miller in 96 is there a significant difference between PAS and the AD? There is not. The only difference that need exists is the person who actually administers the dosage. The same values that support the patient's right to refuse treatment, support the ethical permissibility of euthanasia, individual autonomy, and well-being. The advantage of PAE compared with PAS is that there's less chance of botching the death. More social acceptance and methods are preferable. And PAS leads to inadvertent use. Drugs have zero oversight once they're prescribed, and for a physician presence is not required by the plan. Norton, 15 states where AS has been legalized, there's little oversight of the meds prescribed. None require the presence of the physician. The physician issues the prescription and is fulfilled by the patient. There is no oversight once the drug leaves the pharmacy. Stats reveal a disturbing number of dosages are unaccounted for. Almost 50% of the dosage are undocumented. Just for 2013, no laws and procedures for accounting for prescriptions. Once issued, disposal of unused medications is hardly sufficient to address drugs so powerful they can kill within a minute. Once prescriptions leave the pharmacy, there's no telling where they will end up, and physician assistance leads to inadvertent use. Euthanasia solves because it ensures Service Physician Administration Golden. In 10, there is no monitoring or control once the prescription is written. Physicians are not required to be present. No one knows what will happen. The agents are not used by patients. Reports make clear that patients are for other classes. Drugs could be used in homes with no oversight to protect public safety. We do not want. We do not have a way to track if somebody else chooses to use it. An inadvertent use causes child intake and death. Overall, prescribing prescription drug trends prove Copeland, Russell, and 13. There is a direct correlation between prescription use and increasing number of kids being poisoned or children are taking drugs off the bottles and packaging is not enough to keep kids out of for a kid to figure out how to remove it at no impact to their liberal endless interventions, which answers their impact out of spray instead of in the hands of a parent. Either prevention could be a bad policy for endless warfare. However, the American political system with its checks and balances was designed for the purpose of containing the executive Vietnam and Iraq within the war is disciplined in public attitude to claim that a policy which includes the preventative option might lead to a search for total security is not convincing. This rhetorical charge against prevention is a stock favorite among prevention's critics. It can be dismissed for what it is a debating point with little pragmatic merit, and liberalism is ethical Schwarzenegger, even if one rejects enlightened metaphysics, democratic norms are deployed by political presence rather than abstract philosophical argument. Post-structuralist theory has been an institutional analysis for the idealism of abstract philosophy. Hard political choices yield social policies and political outcomes that fix identities, as well as transform the death of the subject radically precludes political agency. The very act of altering of adhering to a belief as a choice is engaged in social exclusion and repression. After post-structuralism exposes the lie of human identities, individuals still wish to act in concert with others, to use human communication to influence others. People generally understand themselves as capable of agency, no matter how hard one tries to substitute an aesthetic ethical sensibility. A political activist cannot escape engaging in justification with fellow citizens if all forms of identity are predicated upon exclusion, and the theorists need to distinguish all among those identities which exclude in a democratic way and those which exclude in an anti-humanist, racist, and sexual manner. And extinction first, Fosterman 12, extinction risks are underestimated. Existential risk mitigation may be more priority over the alleviation of life and suffering. A human life is a human life. Future generations matter in proportion to their numbers. Existential risk mitigation has a much higher utility than anything else. There are so many people that become into existence, even a small reduction in the probability of realizing this enormous skill outweigh no root causes. Hypothetical root cause arguments obscure rather than enlightened criminals not responsible for their crime because of root causes. Such thinking rules not the idea of human conscience and moral responsibility. If we doubt, we will have because of a belief in a myth of root causes. Then the will becomes either paralyzed or undisciplined, and autonomy is 100% inevitable. Your author,
Autoimmunity.
Autoimmunity is 100% inevitable. Dro in 12. Young people find themselves in society that seeks to silence them. They are told to assume responsibility for their fate, viewed as unproductive, excess, and expendable. Society views young people as a target of its governing through the youth crime complex. Youth constituted present, absent, sympathetic of the society that serves against itself, punishes pre-children at the risk of killing the entire body politic. All bets are off regarding the future of democracy. What is lost is the very idea that the public and the notion of connecting learning to social change and developing modes of civic engagement, of civic courage infused by the principles of social justice under economic Darwinism. The U.S. puts children in supermax prisons in an echo of the war on terror. Young people and others marginalized have been abandoned by democracy in light of militarism, neoliberalism, and religious fundamentalism. And state terrorism, the suicidal state will continue to engage in autonomous practices.
Dissent, uniqueness evidence. The second one, the highlighted portion says, by focusing on affordability, reliability, adaptability, and protecting the environment, we follow this message by issuing an executive order in which he created the Michigan Agency for Energy, which he charged with developing energy policy programs. It goes on to say, Michigan utilities will successfully meet the renewable energy premise under Part 295 to produce 10% of their energy from renewable resources. Despite claims this mandate would be too expensive, the utilities met this obligation easily, generated billions in in-state investment, all quite affordability. In fact, new wind power developments in Michigan is more economical than building new coal-fired power plants, which is your eternal link. And then it goes on to say 75% of voters favor moving away from coal to other clean fuels. First of all, how does past initiatives...
correct that our evidence says that.
How does past initiatives not solve the impact? And second, why does 75% of voters mean that... Why does that prove that the initiative is going
because we've read a link about the plan being controversial in the state legislature, and because we've read an internal link about the Great Lakes and about why the new bill is vital to reduce pollution.
Your new bill
in the
says
Great
it's
Lakes.
good because of pollution, because of coal-fired power plants, which your evidence says
yeah,
the status
and
quo is
things
already
like
solving.
those wind energy grants or whatever you're talking about were not for coal plants that were by the Great Lakes.
It says, in
and
fact, new
that's
wind power
talking about
development in Michigan is more economical
and
than
that's
building
talking about coal
than
emissions in the bill that would be passed
No,
in the
it's
state
not.
legislature.
It's talking about
I disagree.
status quo. All right, you can disagree. The second, why would the people in Michigan House and Senate vote against a bill that 75% of their constituents agree with?
Well, I thought you said 70, but regardless,
70,
our evidence indicates that PAS is uniquely controversial because of the Kevorkian legacy, which means that both Republicans and Democrats are likely to backlash against it. Our evidence also takes into account recent instances of people wanting to get PAS and says that
I don't think
the
it's
status
your
quo
evidence is like a sentence long.
means it's not.
Your-
Let's see. Let's count
the,
how many. It's 1, 2, 3. It's actually 5 sentences, I think.
All right. First is that for court's counterplan. How does the court?
It's not a court's counterplan.
Whatever.
The courts may be involved in the process, but
sure. How does guaranteeing a constitutional right solve any portion of the act? It just says that physician-assisted suicide is available.
It invalidates.
Or is not constitutional.
Yeah, there would be no more state prohibitions against PAs.
Yeah, state prohibitions are now invalidated.
How does that solve the act? The act assumes that physician-assisted suicide happens.
Because yeah, would.
Counterplan gets rid of the ban without legalizing.
Yeah, that's true.
What's the status?
Conditional.
All right, stop. 542. Just saving it. Whose case state debating?
Huh?
Whose case state debating is doing?
I don't know.
Oh, I'm thinking. Never mind. I'm thinking of Elsa. It's been a long tournament. Very specific.
Congress should do it through constitutional amendment counterplan. Administered death counterplan. In Michigan, doctor-patient trust. Everyone good? One second, actually, sorry. Hold up. Okay.
The 1AC is about imagining the legalization of PAS. The sovereign is supposed to protect us against the enemy other, but is put in an impossible position through legalization by forcing it to authorize the death of one of its own citizens. Our solvency is not just pass the plan, then deconstruction. We use PAS laws as a starting point from which to examine autoimmunity, otherness, and death writ large. Hard says this interrogation is the starting point for deconstructing other forms of sovereign violence based upon a fear of the other, but imagining legalization is key. Otherwise, fear of the other will lead to a lack of social solidarity, militaristic policies domestically and internationally, market deregulation, and policies driving social death because of otherness is seen as a threat to power. That's a piece of Rowan 12 evidence. Go to the line by line. They say that ultimately mistakes lead to fear. One, our argument is not based upon necessarily individual is our solvency is not based upon the individual having a different relationship with death. It's about using legalization of PAS to reimagine, to rethink the logic of the law and the way in which the law necessarily tries to protect us from otherness, and that is protect us from otherness. And they say the counterplan leads to they say that the counterplan is able to solve the botched suicides. Not true. Euthanasia probably leads to more botched. Euthanasia probably leads to more botched suicides. I'm not really sure why necessarily. If the doctor gets the choice to kill someone, that means that the doctor gets the choice to kill someone. That's necessarily better than the patient getting to choose to die. Extend the Louis and 11 evidence. Louis says it's going to be inevitable either way, but the fact that Louis says it's going to be inevitable either way, but in a world in which the doctors do it and there's no regulations to how the doctors do it, that only leads to more botched suicides. They say there's no inadvertent. They say it leads to inadvertent death. The child intake impacts about generic prescriptions, not about PAS pills, which is a significant all cause, and I think it's the only impact, and I think it's the only impact to also make them prove an empirical case in which this is necessarily true. No instances of children getting a hold of barbiturates used for drugs. They say no endless war, but extend the piece of Jerome 13 evidence. Yes, it is autoimmunity necessarily leads to war because the only cause is necessarily the root cause of war. We are not necessarily, it's not necessarily a root cause claim. It is a precondition for violence claim, i.e. the only possibility for violence comes from this larger structure in which the otherness of the person who threatens us is seen as something that we necessarily have to protect ourselves against. That's what the piece of Jerome evidence is talking about, and we control the root cause. Violence is only possible to control our political paradigms. It means control all of us outside the world order. Lucas in 13. Sovereign laws, capacity to nullify life, and sovereign right to right and death lead to the other institute contra rebellion was subject to the modality of tendency. Sovereign powers found themselves in position to discover due to accidental occurrences. The challenge about political power seeks to rise by normalize the acceptance of the challenge of the aleatory challenge the unpredictable possibilities of particular circumstances of the individual person now control life is in fact control the egalitarian intangible life to power we exercise powers that it means that it justifies the end of order, peace, and stability. The reason ancient modern biological sovereignty can never revert to that they rely on laws to assume objective justification of violence, normalization, and exception, being understood as a perpetual civil war amongst all living creatures where it remains constant justification of violence in response to civil war, circularity between states, corrupt exception of the violence justified. They say liberalism is ethical. No, see the wise extension of the Jerome evidence of our Lucas evidence above extinction. They say extinction first, but existence is not an absolute value. Piper and 9 values found more than Protestant simplicity and conscious and articulate life. Human life sometimes chooses to change the ground of choice. Values means derived from its own life experience. Sometimes change the choose death. This is meaning preferable to continuation of their ideas, values, principles, and purpose for whom which we would give up our lives to make such choices. We are at least implicitly saying that our death helps someone who is left behind in certain circumstances. We regard to helping another being is entire value. In order to choose death sooner rather than later be an active. More statute in your existence is not an absolute value. They say they try to read this piece of Jerome evidence. I think they're misquoting it. Obviously, read our Jerome card. It's in context of autoimmunity in general. He's just talking about how one function of autoimmunity is keeping is like the social dispossession of juveniles. Constitutional. Perm do both solves any possibility resolves of an individual link. Also states I don't think it necessarily avoids states. A constitutional amendment requires a ratification of 2/3 of the states, which means there's still a significant risk there's a significant risk that one of the states is necessarily going to ratify it. Specifically, Michigan, shouldn't give the benefit of the doubt. There's over a 50% chance that it would ultimately. That means that there's at least over a 50% chance because it requires 2/3, which means it probably means the counterplan and.
It doesn't solve the app. It doesn't mean
Oh yeah.
Physician-assisted suicide happens.
Oh yeah, also doesn't solve the app, doesn't mean physician-assisted suicide happens, just guarantees a right. That doesn't throw a court ruling. Administered death. One, they say that legally administered death is necessarily different. One, this is about euthanasia. Our argument is evidence about euthanasia. All of our evidence is specifically in context of physician-assisted suicide because it's because solvency, because our cross-apply the hard's evidence, the solvency for the act specifically predicated upon the patient making a request and the doctor being able to respond to that request. It's not a one-way street. It has to be that communal relationship which is necessary to being able to solve, which means that euthanasia just legalizes the one-way possibility of the doctor being able to kill the patient, which if anything just reifies that notion of liberal subject, which means not able to solve. And our interpretation is that they get one dispositional argument. For the rest of strategies, they can run contradictory arguments with no risk, but when we respond, they can cross-apply contradictory answers links. And preconditionality. Conditionality should occur before the debate causes them to test for ideas due to deep research and leads to better clash in education. There's it's no-risk offenses involved, makes it impossible for us to effectively distribute offense or term to get to a C strategy because not even straight turning position is strategic when it can be kicked at any time. It's a vote of fairness in education. And multiple positions in the 1 and C contradict with each other. They make arguments about liberalism, then make counterplans possible that are able to solve the case. They also make that are trying to solve the case. They also read multiple. They also say they also make
states bad, states good.
Yeah, they say states bad and states good. That's bad conditional and contradictory politics. And authentic creates a pathological paradox that means we can never truly know the meaning of any action. See me in 7. Some may agree about a situation stock saying for power, but all of us can agree that the world's terrorists now made Iraq central front of the war on terror, especially in the never know. Doesn't mean Iraq is for preventing a false potential cause for potential politics, potential nature that requires conditional logic. Conditional statement cannot be wrong. Because it only serves potential because you can't prove the negative is categorical error to give empirical reasons for your actions. Your actions right and as long as you're politically conditional with policy and simply act trigger direction of what you hear the direction of the effect follows smoothies reflex and will do both. Michigan. This DA is a complete shit show. I'm not even going to have to read a card to be able to answer it. The uniqueness evidence says that 70% of the people in Michigan necessarily want the bill to pass, which means that there's a very high risk that you need to get overwhelmingly because there's already massive support for it. Now, link evidence is god-awful, just says that there's a bad legacy of this says that physician-assisted suicide wouldn't be popular in Michigan because of Kevorkian. Never makes the claim that that would lead to any kind of spillover to the political process in the specific people who are pushing the bill right now, which means there's a very high lead threshold they have to count. Also, status quo is able to solve. He's already being able, cross-ex proves he's already establishing certain programs that are going to be able to, they're going to be sufficient to solve for the environment. In addition to the fact that people already want the bill, also this links to the counterplan because because again, 2/3 of the states necessarily have to ratify it, which means Michigan would probably be involved in the ratification process. No reason why the Michigan ratifying a constitutional amendment is not a bigger link to politics than just simply legalizing the bill through the state Congress. Also, the case is able to solve cross-apply the Juro evidence, the Varl Lucas and 13 evidence. The reason that environmental violence happens in the status quo is because we see the environment as an object to be manipulated however it wants by a certain by the liberal subject, which means that the only possibility for combating this kind of for combating the impact is by breaking down that liberal subject, allowing for a more communal relation with others, and for being writ large. Also, a logical policymaker could do both. Also, the impact evidence is god awful. It says about coal pollution around the entire Great Lakes region. There's a shit ton of area around the Great Lakes, also in Canada, that they just simply cannot solve for. They at best only solve for Michigan. Doctor-patient trust. Trust in U.S. doctors is extremely low, young, and 14. Healthcare as a measure of how poorly compared to other countries. The literal medicine compares polls on all things considered doctors in countries gave trust. American doctors finished 24th in the world, 2 head of Bulgarian, 3 head of Russia. Modern interests keep us light years from where we need to be, and legalization doesn't affect trust. This is the only study that's going to be read in the debate. Holland 5, there's disagreement by 58% of the participants, agreed by only 20% that legalizing euthanasia would cause them trust of personal decision. Less the remainder were neutral overall. He's mostly separate from positive views about the effect of decision 89 on trust for significant correlated participants under trust their physicians and their satisfaction with care, and trust low but doesn't affect care. NPR and 14, a survey in the New England Journal of Medicine found the United States ranked 3rd out of 29 countries patient satisfaction treatment, 24 patient trust in doctor. Overall, adults from low-income families in the U.S. are slightly less significant. Trusting of patients, 47% of low-income adults report trust in doctors, which 63% non-low-income adults. Also, major disparity between the link and the impact. For them to win the full access to their impact, they have to win that it completely not only collapses doctor-patient trust, but people just stop fucking going to doctors, and that there's no possibility that doctors have any say or any kind of intervention into diseases. I think that the anti-vaxxer movement gets bigger as a result of the plan. That's not a reason why literally the entire medical infrastructure that's keeping disease down necessarily collapses, and the impacts on unique global pandemics have occurred before without causing extinction. And there's ultimately immunity. There are billions of people under some population will be immune. This is what happened with the bubonic plague, and resource disease killed millions of people. Every available resource would be deterred for research containment, and disease won't cause extinction. Live 195 any micro people. If I can still, I would have to be strong once today, exclusively the lowest healthy everything so doctor gets to be to deadly virus not to bring. They cannot be everything once to alarm us and collective point of winning out the imitation microstrong life force.
Ready?
Yep.
Euthanasia counterplan. You say or the physician administration, same thing. You say that euthanasia destroys or doesn't destroy the liberal subject. What is the reason for this?
Yeah, sure. The hardest evidence is specific to the fact that what causes that breakdown of liberal subject is that currently the doctor is seen as a murderer in the status quo, and what causes the contradiction that our solvency is based upon is that when the patient makes the request for death, the doctor can respond to that request.
So,
right?
in a world of the counterplan, the patient requests death, and the doctor can say yes.
I mean,
Yes, it is. The only difference is that the doctor administers it.
Euthanasia means the doctor can decide when the patient can die and can implement that by his own choice.
False. The request still has to be issued.
So
Yes,
you think
there is
just the doctor deciding to just kill the patient with it.
That is what euthanasia is.
There are
yes.
two different types of euthanasia. One could be through a request.
A.
The other could not be through a request.
Interesting.
That's why
Not specified.
criticize
Interesting.
euthanasia.
Interesting interpretation. The other
How is that an interesting
No.
interpretation? That's what euthanasia is.
the other counterplan. Why does the counterplan require a constitutional amendment? The counterplan has the federal government create a constitutional right. Why is that requiring a
Any
constitutional amendment?
constitutional amendment requires two different states to ratify. Right.
Okay, so the solvency advocate is like the courts would create a ruling and Congress would like affirm that ruling or pass legislation guaranteeing a right. What's the link to this argument?
I mean, the only possible way that there would be guaranteed access to it would be via some kind of amendment, because that's the only possible way that it would get implemented. Even if there is a right, that does not mean the states will necessarily have it implemented, and people will be able to get access to it.
Cool. The trust debate.
Actually, also I think the counterplan's the status
That's
quo.
fine. I've moved on. The trust evidence that says trust in doctors is low now. Where did this evidence is about polls from the New England Journal of Medicine and all things considered, can your doctors be trusted? It says that compared to other countries, it's 24th. Why does this mean that trust in doctors is still not relatively high?
24th out of 29, which shows that it's
Yeah, in the
comparatively
world. Why does
low
that matter?
nationally.
If we win, that trust is still sufficiently high to prevent anti-vaxxers.
47%
The next
of
two pieces of evidence both ignite as to why there is.
What is your evidence? This evidence establish a threshold for what level of trust would need to be sufficient to
Where did you
I think that exact same question could be begged of your evidence. You don't.
Well, I think our evidence does make that claim. I'm asking you where this
Sure,
evidence.
it does.
Why does it matter if if trust is low
You
compared
should
to other
read the
countries?
rest of that card. 47% of low-income adults reported trust in doctors versus 63% of non-low-income adults.
Why
Plus,
does
there's
it-
other statistic analysis that shows that there is a majority of adults who do not support
the link
doctors
evidence?
now.
Where does the evidence about not affecting trust assume that it's legal? Where was this study taken? The Hall evidence.
The Hall evidence?
Yeah.
It was. I think it was a photo review of several people. I forget what the site was.
Counterplan is for the federal government to preempt the state bans on PAS. Bans on PAS only exist at the state level, and the Counterplan federally invalidates those bans, which makes it impossible for the states to prohibit PAS. There is no solvency deficit. PASs would still occur in exactly the same way post-plan. It's just a change of the actor and the mechanism of legalization, which they've conceded is competitive because they didn't say perm to the Counterplan. Permutation do both obviously links to the net benefit because it still includes state legalization, which is what the politics this set is based on. The Counterplan requires zero state action. It simply removes the state's ability to make a decision on the subject. To the fair, in 7, federal control can eliminate deferring use because federal law preempts state law. If powerless states approach state culture, preventing them from contributing. Preemption makes state action impossible, prevents the links to politics. Firstly, intent preemption doctrine allows Congress to invalidate state law, close off the state regulatory authority with nothing more than intent, no conflict is required, and states couldn't respond. It's beyond their responsibility because their authority has been displaced. The bill in 95, the power of the FG to displace state laws divest states the ability to regulate preemption and desirable to prevent states from taking action. The other Counterplan. The Counterplan is a preferable option to the plan. The only distinction is that the plan is self-administration and the Counterplan has the physician administer the medication. That means that the exact same doctor-patient conversations happen. The patient still has complete choice over the time and place. The patient is reassured by the existence of a suicide option. The patient self-determines the method of death, and the Counterplan provides a humane death. That's Miller. Error negative, 1, sufficiency. Even if it's not perfect, the Counterplan radically reshapes social orientation to death. Their quibbles are outweighed by the extreme pain and suffering of a botched or inadvertent suicide. And their 2AC and their 1AC evidence references euthanasia as being sufficient. Their McDormand evidence is about the right to die generally, and multiple places in the ununderlined text of the card reference euthanasia, and all their Hardy's cards are about the right to die, presenting a challenge to sovereignty, which the Counterplan does just as well. In the cross-section of the 1AC, it was explicitly established that the mechanism for solving their liberalism and biopower is the patient being able to choose to die, and we still imagine that they get that right with the Counterplan, which means there is zero possible solvency deficit. They do not understand what euthanasia is. The Counterplan does not have it's not just like the doctor gets to arbitrarily decide, like, oh, this guy has a cold, I'm gonna like take him out. It doesn't make any sense. Like there's still like a process that the patient requests it, and then you have to get an appointment, so it might be like constrained by the doctor's schedule or something. But that is not a meaningful solvency differential. Here is what the distinction is on Wichita in 97. Euthanasia is intentional termination of life by someone other than the patient at the patient's request. PAS is helping the patient to terminate her life at his or her request. Conditionality will be in the 1R. Permutation do both. Links to the net benefit. The permutation provides physicians a choice to recommend euthanasia or PAS, and if this choice is available, they will push for PAS. On Wichita in 97, euthanasia is the intentional termination of life by someone other than the patient. PAS is helping the patient terminate her life. Data was collected by questionnaires in cases where there was a choice. Most physicians assisted in suicide. PAS was selected for moral reasons. And if given the choice, people will choose to not have the doctor present. Mayor and Ted, once terminally ill, the patient who took the prescription vomited up. Part of it because he had sold 6 cans of Pepsi. The physician wasn't there. The patient woke up and felt like a slave several times before finally dying. 28 hours later, a terminally ill woman swallowed the drug. Too slowly. The problem was patients refused to have a physician present to make sure proper procedures were followed. The net benefit to the Counterplan is just based on the existence of PAS causing botching and inadvertent use, which means that the permutation cannot possibly resolve the link to the net benefit. The case. Okay. Their solvency explanation makes literally zero sense. For the idea of forcing the state to confront its own desire to keep citizens alive is disproven by the fact that PAS actually is legal in Oregon and Washington and multiple states in the European Union, like the Netherlands, and surprise, surprise, they're all still liberalists. They didn't confront and challenge and reshape the entirety of the way that it functions. Their Giroux evidence offers and gives a bunch of political and economic reasons why liberalism still happens, like the fact that elites can control politics, the fact that there's a large prison industrial complex. They have no mechanism by which to change those things. They assert that they are a starting point, but starting point to what? The cross-section of the 1AC was incredibly vague. They don't establish any mechanism or any way that they can actually get to changing any of these things. Don't give them credit for solving something just because they criticize it. Wajah and 5. Postmodernist critique metaphysical systems is fixing the idea, translating to fixing practice, such a deal with understanding political and economic context, pressures and motivations with desire for power regardless of consequences. Postmodern thought does not problematize passage from knowledge into action. Though we know that our metaphysical foundations are other unfriendly and automatically translates into abandoning those ways postmodernists become ideals who do not problematize the assumptions of the world. They ideas perceive the world of matter in a causal manner. Remember, they assume that automatic translatability of fixing a philosophical system which automatically fix the institutions stem from that. Now I say that fear of the other causes war. Our gray evidence answers this. There is no risk of endless war from liberal interventions because the public has been soured on foreign adventures after Iraq and Afghanistan. They are tired of it and will not vote for politicians who propose those who will backlash and not allow those things to happen. Zero evidence to that claim. Even if there's some structural components that would cause liberalism to lead to war, there are pragmatic concerns that mean politicians won't do do it because they want to get reelected, and the public will backlash. Also, the idea that all war is caused by fear of the other is absurd. Our Hutchinson evidence says there is no root cause of war. You can't oversimplify it. There are a bunch of different reasons why states can and have gone to war, and it cannot be reduced. For example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we went there and took it because we wanted to get their oil, i.e. not because we were afraid of the other, but because we wanted something that another country had, which their explanation and their oversimplification and reduction cannot explain why that would occur. Also, our Schwartz evidence answers their arguments about the relationship to the other under liberalism. It says that even if there is some inevitably exclusive component of liberalism, there are different degrees of exclusion, right? So we can have like a democracy, and that could potentially exclude someone because they don't agree with democratic values. However, there's a qualitative difference between that and just killing the other, and liberalism can exist in those like cracks between the absolute rejection of the other and just like democratic exclusions that can preserve liberal values, and that means that liberalism can be a positive way of relating to the other. Now, the botching and the inadvertent use net benefit. Okay. PES includes zero oversight to prevent inadvertent use. They will fall into the hands of people who are not the patients, and they will take those. They will be used by people to murder other people because they will get the pills, and then they will use it to kill other people against their will, or it will be taken inadvertently by people who don't know what the pills are, possibly children and possibly other people. They have no carded response to this, no defense of the ability to regulate where the pills end up. There is no follow-up because the patients just get the pills and then they can use them. But if they don't use all of them because they're given more than just in a full dose, or if they decide not to take the pills at all, then they could end up falling into other people's hands, and that will cause death. That will cause death to people who don't want to die, which is they have no reason why that would be justified. PES includes zero oversight to prevent inadvertent use, and they'll fall into the hands of folks other than the patient. And 12, PES lacks safeguards and disconcerting, suggestible, potentially dangerous ramifications to life. Any public safety oversight of the lethal drug is obtained a suicide prescription fall into the hands of someone for whom it was not prescribed. No medical professional is required to be with the person with 80 to 100 pills are consumed. And PES has zero oversight and no recall. Ensures loose drugs, Louisiana 13, in Oregon and Washington, there is no oversight for lethal medications. If the patient picks up the drugs and take them, no one can use them wherever they please. There is no recall for lethal drugs in the pharmacy. Based on uncertainty to the patient to where the drugs ended up, there will be abuse. The Counterplan solves this because there is no they don't just give a bunch of pills to the patient. And actually, the doctor has to administer the medication, which means that it won't fall into the wrong hands. The botching that benefit, assisted suicide will lead to botched suicide. Where people either fail to die from taking the medication because they took it incorrectly, or took a bunch of other stuff that completely contradicted with the effects of and prevented from having the correct effects on their body to kill them, or it will cause them to die in a very slow and painful manner that screws up their relationship to death and is independently really messed up to allow to happen, because people who are seeking relief from their suffering because they're terminally ill will just suffer a lot more and potentially not even end up dying as a result of their attempt at receiving assisted suicide, which turns the relationship to death. It also turns their social relationship to death. Example, because they are publicized in Oregon and Washington, and that sours the public on the idea of PAS. The Counterplan solves it. They have no warrant for why euthanasia would be botched. The doctor is an expert who is present and can prevent the patient from doing other things that would screw up the way the medication functions. Assisted suicide leads to botching. Calderona in 14, many assisted suicide experience complications. Assisted suicide is strongly marked as peaceful escape from suffering, hateful and scary death into gasping muscle spasms, fallacy, vomiting, panic, confusion, failure, produce unconsciousness, waking from unconsciousness and failure, cause death. Most comprehensive study on clinical problems with assisted suicide found 80% experience problems. The patient had problems including waking up from coma, not being comatose, and not dying after becoming comatose. Now, what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, the extinction Bostrom debate. Okay. Extinction outweighs their impacts. It shuts down all possibility of future value. Future lives will be lived, and a human life is a human life, whether it occurs now or in 1,000 years, which means you have an ethical obligation to preserve the existence of future generations. There are positive values associated with living, like happiness, etc., which neither of us are contesting. Just because some people could benefit from dying and could choose to die is not a reason why extinction extinction is not something you should consider. It would still be bad to kill a bunch of people that do not want to die, are not seeking assistance in dying, and experience other positive values. If they continue living.
I guess I'm curious, if people don't want the doctor there when they die, why is that bad?
Because of the net benefits.
If it's true that they don't want the doctor there, why wouldn't they just use the underground physician-assisted suicide market?
Because the reason why it's underground now is because there's not a mechanism for them to go through, right?
Yeah,
they ask their
they
patient.
don't want to use the doctor. So why wouldn't they just try to kill themselves by the underground market?
Dude, the underground market includes the doctor. It's underground. This is what it is, just factually, and also what your card is about. In the status quo, patients ask their doctors to help them die,
and the doctors sometimes agree even though it's illegal. That's what the underground market refers to. Like it involves the doctor no matter what. But the counterplan displaces that by providing a legal channel they can go through. So in the world of the counterplan, when a patient asks their doctor, like, hey, I want to die,
So
they're
just
like,
so
oh,
clear,
okay, do this,
just
and they
so
do
clear,
it.
net benefits to physician-administered death are botched attempts and
Inadvertent use.
inadvertent use. All right, botched attempts. If people don't want the doctor there and they're willing to take that risk of a botched attempt, like, why is that necessarily a unique reason to vote?
Because botched attempts have like really negative consequences. Like they
Yeah.
suffer a lot. They could potentially not actually die as a result.
Yeah, I get that, but I mean, it's not like people just go, like, there's very specific instructions for how this necessarily happens. Like, is there, like, any kind of study you're citing or any kind of empirics for, like, these botched attempts?
Yeah, we have like a ton of
Physician-assisted
cards
suicide?
that cite empirical examples in
Like?
Oregon and Washington. Okay, so there was one instance in which someone took the pill, but before they took it, they like swilled 6 cans of Pepsi because they wanted to like do that before they died, and then that caused them to like throw up part of the medication. There are other instances where people took it too slowly or didn't take enough of the pills that they were given. Like, these are things that would not happen if a doctor was present, and they are things that cause the suicide attempt to fail and be really painful and cause a lot of
Fair.
suffering.
That's
Like,
fine.
I admit it is a small net benefit, but the counterplan solves literally all of the case.
Fair. Inadvertent use, like, what is the size and scope of how many people, like, get affected by inadvertent use?
I don't think our evidence quantifies it.
So do you have any, like, empirical data regarding who gets a hold of these pills in Oregon and Washington?
What do you mean by what? We
Like,
have
do you have any, like,
evidence that says that it has happened.
Does
Like,
it
I don't know if that fulfills your like threshold for like an empirical study, but like it would happen, and it has happened in Oregon.
Okay, so, like, if it, I mean, okay, that's fine.
There will be the trust DA, the whatever counterplan, the administrator.
Goes on.
Yeah,
Else you can do that.
euthanasia, and then the Michigan DA.
Dr. Trust,
Euthanasia counterplan.
Euthanasia Counterplan, Michigan DA.
Yep. Right. Everyone good?
One second, pull it up.
No problem. Good. Cool.
Trust DA can see no impact to diseases because of things like burnout. The plan wouldn't affect anyway, and trust is low in the status quo. It was no link that links or no offense. The administration counterpoint conditionality is good. Our interpretation is we get two conditional advocacies, which solves their regression arguments. There's a contradiction between their dispo interpretation and their pre-round conditionality, which means they shouldn't get an interpretation that's good. It's key to strategic thinking. It forces time and strategy pressure because you have to consider argument, interaction, and choice. It's the only portable skill key to negative flexibility and test the app from multiple angles and answer unpredictable 2AC add-ons. It's most logical because policymakers have to evaluate arguments from various sides and narrow down which ensures that it's best decision-making skills are inevitable because of faster speakers, interchangeable arguments, and the blocking two in our check because it makes the debate one world ensures in-depth discussion, reasonability. All theory interpretations are self-serving, which means they have to prove that we make debate possible. We have vote F on theory because it doesn't affirm the resolution, doesn't contradict. We should get a test of their agent and their test of how they achieve right about. One of our counterpoints says that the yes is good when nullify state preemption. The other says that doctors should administer themselves. Now, conditional ethics are good. Edition 93 in partiality involves telling the story of a situation in the plurality perspective that constituted as a public phenomenon. This situation in partiality is neither objective, just integrated, nor explicitly identified within a single wish is what it is not turned on the claim to be a disembodied vitiated vision from nowhere, but neither does it turn from the experiences of subjugation. The disembodied vision and the embodied claim to an anti-privilege from opposition are equally suspect, both define knowledge from positionality. They differ only in this state that they assign objective to opposite poles of the knowledge. The knowledge, power, and access standpoint of claims are insufficient because they ignore the complex of social relations that mediate knowledge and power. The Michigan just
and conditional ethics are inevitable because they have to be neg against PAS.
and conditional ethics are inevitable because they have to be neg against PAS, the Michigan DA. You don't have a piece of evidence to answer the disadvantage in an offense-defense paradigm. A 1% risk of the net benefit means that outweigh Governor Snyder is Governor Snyder is a GOP governor in Michigan in a state controlled with a legislature controlled by the GOP, which means that there is sufficient support for a bill in the status quo. But the plan ruins his PC with his party, which is our internal link. Now the Senate piece of 1NC SEL and 12 elements to dedicate the healthy Great Lakes are key to check extinction because of the rich biodiversity and species that live in this area. There's an invisible threshold for biodiversity loss, which means you should prioritize it in your impact calculus. There are intervening actors that can resolve things like endless interventions, but you cannot come back from environmental collapse. Michigan is the only state that touches all of the Great Lakes, which means that it is key to send an international signal now. Michigan energy policy is modeled nationally wide in 127. This is a United States issue. We need to make ourselves self-sufficient, efficient, and energy resilient when it comes to energy. Progress is being made in Michigan. Steps and strides in the right direction are served as a model for other states. The Great Lakes state leads the nation in net zero water policies. Michigan is naturally and culturally a leader, and we are very proud to lead the country in this effort. And more evidence: Michigan's coal pollution is key. Michigan LC and 12 Michigan is among the Great Lakes leaders in a very dubious category. A report listed Michigan among the world's among the worst mercury polluters, and the Great Lakes DTA's plan makes rank as the second worst polluter in the Great Lakes region. The solution to this disaster is a transition away from coal and to renewable energy, as it being home to the second worst point of pollution in the Great Lakes wasn't enough. We are way behind in terms of energy goals. We are still aiming for a far worker 10% by 2015, rather than being a leader in having the dirtiest coal plants. Michigan should lead the region in its use of coal and renewable energy. Your Giroux evidence obviously doesn't turn the DA because it's some nebulous claim about the environment, and the Great Lakes would already have collapsed because of increasing coal pollutions by the time you would ever have some potential in the future to spill over to causing environmental transition in Michigan. Michigan. The uniqueness of Snyder's energy panel will pass now. That's the Milquist and Wozniak evidence. It's the perfect compromise, which ensures that renewable sufficiency without mandating it. There's a bipartisan momentum now, but Snyder's leverage is key, which means that you should refer to the direction to link it will pass. But the Republicans, it's just a question of Republicans, Pluto and Clark and 39. Right now, there's a sense of urgency about dealing with this. It's expected that federal clean air rules will soon force Michigan power plants to close. That's a takeover concern to Snyder, who broadly wants to ramp up Michigan's recovery. This is not an issue. Republican ideas against Democratic ones. Energy politics doesn't fit neatly in two partisan boxes. Democrats are generally on board with greater policy. Republicans is who we're keeping an eye on now. They make an argument about EXO being able to solve it. Legislation is key. Gomberg in 122. The clock runs out on Michigan's current renewable energy standard this year. The policy is not striking the state's utilities would have no incentive to continue investing in renewable energy to reap all the environmental and public health benefits that renewable energy can provide. Snyder and the Michigan legislature should be working this year to strengthen the state's renewable energy standard and give Michiganers the clean energy future they deserve. They make this argument about 70%, but this is out of context. That was a poll that asked voters if they would support a candidate who likes renewables, not specific to the bill about the Great Lakes itself, and doesn't assume that PAS has been legalized. For all the uniqueness arguments above, status quo doesn't resolve because of the EXO cards I read. And the other argument was about was about the bill, which hasn't passed us. They say the link evidence is bad. You didn't read a piece of evidence on this debate, but I'll do the link to it now. PS is massively controversial in Michigan. That's the 1NC Hassens evidence referred to WSU in 15. Hassens says that the legacy of Kevorkian means that the issue would be political suicide. Get it? For legislators means that the plan would fracture the GOP, compromise on energy and the status quo, because the GOP would be pissed off that their governor abandoned them on and introduced new controversial legislation which forced them to take sides on a risky issue right before election campaign. Fiat also means that Snyder would have to take a position and get involved in the debate, which he is not doing in the status quo. The plan cost capital and anti-PS interests are entrenched in Michigan. Deplin in 3-4. There also has been no recent activity on the subject in the legislature. The last effort was in 98 when a proposal was introduced as a ballot proposal. The measure was defeated by 71%. Voting no. The medical industry remains the largest opponent of the A, enabling strong believes that PS is incompatible with the physician's role as healer. The 98 vote proved that we don't need a as that group, along with the Michigan Catholic Conference, played a major role in raising $5.5 million for the campaign opposing the effort. GOP would oppose the plan. Solomon in 12, the Republican platform promises a restoration of the constitutional government. That sounds good to you. You may not want to spoil feelings by dividing into the disturbing details details. Republicans love federalism, except when it comes to assisted suicide, which they want to prevent under the CSA. CSA that says intrinsically judges and analysts deciding which policies legislators and courts should channel their influence in limited influence towards enacting, which means that they have to pick and choose between issues that prioritize intrinsicness as a voting issue because it proves the resolution insufficient and kills negative ground because the USG has to take action and destroys the politics system, which is good. It's key to negative ground, especially on a broad topic. 4 topic areas. The other argument was about coal plants not being sufficient. That was all done on the top of the debate. They don't have evidence. Offense defense paradigm means 1% risk of net benefit is good because Counterplan solves. I didn't answer because I thought you. I'll send out a new doc with only the
good? You're all right. Cool.
Physician-assisted suicide is inevitable. It's just a question whether it's legal or Louis evidence today. Louis evidence is unique to this question that they have not answered, even if it's true. Botched procedures happen because of physician-assisted suicide. They have made the argument that people are going to go or prefer to get physician-assisted suicide than euthanasia anyway, which means even if it's true that the Counterplan solves the affirmative botched procedures as well as inadvertent use is also inevitable through the underground market. There's no explanation how the Counterplan is able to solve the underground market, especially if the patients want physician-assisted suicide. Now, grew the top of the two, and we obviously have a mechanism or being able to solve the affirmative. Our hardest evidence says that a larger injection of right to die appeals into the legal system allows us to interrogate the larger structure. That larger structure solves the obviously two states that have legalized physician-assisted suicide does not meet the threshold of challenging overall broader forms of liberal sovereignty and broader forms of autoimmunity. Mojave evidence doesn't make an argument. There's a lot of words. There's also not just criticizing just to criticize, but whether a mechanism. There's not a disadded deconstruction in the block, which means I have a high threshold for any solvency deficit. For any solvency deficit made. They say that there are no root cause debate. They say that there might be structural components, but politics prevent war. If that's true, that people would not vote for politicians that go to war. It's also true that politicians would not vote against policy, and that politicians would not vote against policies that are popular with the public because of re-election, which takes out the link to the dissent. The second is there's no root cause of war. Doesn't assume autoimmunity is very generic. This is much better on the question of autoimmunity being the root cause because it's shutting off others, the fearing of the other, that they will take something from us that allows us to commit, that allows us to have justification. In addition, they have conceded that we aren't necessarily a root cause claim, but a precondition for violence claim that allow, as long as autoimmunity exists, there's always a precondition for violence. Now, the inadvertent use, there's not an impact inadvertent use extended other than some people might use it and some people not. That's not an impact that outweighs the affirmative, which means that Dro evidence is largely evidence, which means that Dro evidence largely outweighs. It's also inevitable that it's also inevitable the underground market still allows for them to get that medicine, which means that inadvertent use still happens. They have also conceded that other things like prescription drugs means inadvertent use. Inadvertent use is the matrix thumper. They say botched suicides once again conceded that that's inevitable. I don't think I have to do much work here because they have conceded that because they made the argument that people would prefer physician-assisted suicide, which means legal or not, there will still be botches, which means there's not a uniqueness, which means there's no uniqueness to this argument. They say extinction outweighs concede the fight for evidence. Extinction and existence is only invaluable insofar as that there is value to living. Our McDormand evidence is that is not the status quo. People are locked in hospitals and more like prisons and stripped to their freedom, which means that we're stripped to their freedom now. Stripped to their freedom now. The preemption Counterplan. Look, I think they're in a double line. Either the Counterplan does not solve the act because I don't know how it legalizes physician-assisted suicide around the country, or they are true that it does lead to physician-assisted suicide being legalized around the country, which leads to the Michigan DA because it means that physician-assisted suicide becomes legal in Michigan. There's not a piece of evidence or reason why it would not be blamed on the piece of evidence says it would not be blamed on the governor, which means it's likely that if it's so opposed in Michigan, that is also likely that the Michigan constituents would blame it on the government, which means that links to the Counterplan now, the permutation should be able to resolve all the links, especially in the context of the double line addition. There's not an impact to the discount, which we'll get to later. Now the pick debate. I think I've already done enough work. I've done a lot of the work here. If it's true that people prefer physician-assisted suicide over euthanasia, the underground market is inevitable, which means all their net benefits are also inevitable, which means there's not a unique reason why you should vote. Which means you should vote negative. They have read to Counterplan, which means the presumption flips affirmative, which means that they have to win an external dissat to be from the external dissat. If they don't do that, then you can vote for affirmative on presumption. Now, conditionality or interpretation that we should get one dispositional. You should get one dispositional advocate solves literally all of your office because it allows for you to have negative flexibility while also generating and having fairness. You can see this conditionality allows for 2AC strategy about where to place specific offense. Then is irredeemable because the 2AC is the only place for us to receive offense. You do not reject the argument, or rather you should reject the team because the damage is done. Now, their distinction claim is about active voluntary euthanasia, not passive euthanasia, which their Counterplan does not make it. The Counterplan text does not make a distinction against passive euthanasia. Allows for the doctor to make the call. Active euthanasia does not, which active euthanasia is not, which means there's not, which means active euthanasia is not, which means there's not, which means all of our dis has to euthanasia, which means all of our dis has to euthanasia, which means all of our dis has to euthanasia link. It also means that they're not able to solve the affirmative because passive euthanasia does not allow for us to interrogate the autoimmunity of the physician, which means that it doesn't solve people wanting PAS proves that there's no benefit. Now, in Michigan has said, I think you should have a very high threshold. This should not be an offense-defense thing, but their evidence says that the status quo is able to solve a couple warrants. The first is that people are not, because the 70% want the initiative. Now, they've made the argument that if people want initiatives, that the politicians are likely to go with those initiatives. Proves there's not a link. The second is that the status quo is moving away from coal-fired power plants in the status quo because wind energy is much more efficient. This is their own uniqueness evidence, which takes out the internal link. They've also conceded that your impact evidence is in the context of the entire Great Lakes, which assume that there are power plants literally lining every mile of the Great Lakes, which obviously is not just Michigan, which means other states would be able to, which means other states would be able to thump. Now they have functionally conceded that autoimmunity is the reason why we have environmental destruction in the first place, because we view the environment as pure stock. If we are able to challenge the reason why autoimmunity exists or why that structure exists in the first place, then we're at least able to get inroads to the impact evidence. I don't think there's an impact, which means you should vote on presumption.
or the preemption counterplan condo result of today's counterplan in the case.
PA preemption, euthanasia. Case.
Yep.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay.
Great Lakes biodiversity loss. Critical biodiversity hotspot in the invisible threshold for species loss means that each species that dies is like removing a block from a Jenga tower and erodes the overall resiliency of the tower. You can never know when which species will be the last species that causes the whole thing to collapse. So you should treat each instance of biodiversity loss as if it were the last one would cause total extinction, which is the conceded impact framing argument from the one in our means that if we win the mechanics of the dissent, there is a 100% chance that voting affirmative will result in extinction from biodiversity loss. There, defense of this argument is mostly just like being like, oh come on, they can't have good cards, but they didn't actually indict any of our evidence, and it actually is pretty good. You'll be surprised when you read it. They say 70% means that the public won't vote against it. Look, first, this is like the framing thing. Like, in order for them to win this link defense based on our great evidence, they have to concede that there is no risk of the violence of liberalism ever happening because electoral policies would check it, which means that every bit of the link defense that they win from our great evidence win this. It just means you would vote negative. It just means you would vote negative anyway. Also, there are multiple framing answers that they have an answer. Uniqueness does not overwhelm the link. Our evidence is specific to the political process that surrounds the bill. It says that he needs to get Republicans in line. Snyder is a Republican, and the Republicans mostly support the bill, but there are defections, and he needs to continuously apply political pressure to allow it to pass. Our evidence says it's not a slam dunk in the status quo, and it requires continuous political pressure, which means it will pass, but uniqueness does not overwhelm the link. They've also not answered the argument that the 70% quote is out of context. It's just saying that 70% of the constituency supports renewable energy generally, but not that they support the specific bill, which means you should default to our evidence that defines the process that would surround the passage of the actual bill. Also, obviously, it is a poll of the public in general, but the link story and the internal link is all about Republicans who obviously support renewable energy less, so they wouldn't have the same reason to be beholden to their constituencies, and they are the ones that PDS would upset, and they are the ones that are critical to passage of the bills, and they're the ones critical to passage of the bill. Now they say that our evidence is just about all the Great Lakes. We have read evidence that says that Michigan coal production damages the entirety of the Great Lakes. It is the critical threshold for biodiversity because Michigan touches all the Great Lakes, and they have coal plants on all of them. It's the largest contributing factor, and the invisible threshold means that every risk of reduction of extinction from biodiversity loss should be treated as the entire thing, which is an impact framing argument that they don't have an answer to. Now,
also, all the states in the U.S. model their policies.
Oh yeah, they also dropped that every state in the U.S. models Michigan's policies, which means you do solve all the Great Lakes and we solve renewables and biodiversity generally. Now, the last argument is the autoimmunity root cause argument. There is no possible explanation of how it would be the root cause of Great Lakes biodiversity loss ecostructure, no mechanism by which the plan would ever get to the reduction of coal plants surrounding the Great Lakes, and even if it wouldn't happen fast enough to cause the impact, there will also be case defense that will answer this because we'll go for the no spillover arguments. Now, the preemption counterplan, it solves 100% of the case. There are 3 conceded cards that characterize the process of preemption and say that it does not require any state action. The federal government can unilaterally invalidate all state bans on PAS without requiring any action to be taken from any of the states. Our evidence actually says that it removes the ability of the states to decide on the issue whatsoever, which means there's no possible way that it could be blamed on them or linked to politics. They are just all spin, but don't even know what the process of the counterplan does, which is evident from the way that this debate has played itself out. There is no possible way the counterplan links to the politics because it doesn't require a bill to go through the Michigan legislature, which just doesn't require the expenditure of political capital, and there is no conceivable solvency deficit because we invalidate the entirety of the bans and allow PAS to happen in exactly the same way with just a different action. The permutation argument that it solves the link is totally nonsensical given all the link explanation I did above and not warranted at all. Now the euthanasia counterplan condition, we're not going for it, but conditionality is good. Negative flexibility outweighs all their offense. The affirmative has infinite prep time to select the best evidence, the best case, the best arguments, etc. And we cannot possibly bring that same level of preparation to every single affirmative in the pool, which means we need conditional advocacies as an equalizer so that the negative can get back in the game. Dispositionality doesn't solve negative flexibility because it allows the affirmative to determine the negative strategy, i.e. if we read a counterplan and it kind of sucks, then we shouldn't be forced to be stuck with it for the rest of the debate. We should be able to jettison it and go for other arguments to get back in the game. Also, theory trip doesn't solve testing the app from multiple angles because it's just one dispositional argument, which means we couldn't read a counterplan and a critique in the same sustained debate, testing the data from multiple angles. It's necessary for education in its most real world because Obama had to defend Obamacare against both the socialism counterplan and the anarchy counterplan. They've conceded that skew is inevitable because of procedurals, and we could just write a bunch of diss ads, and some debaters are just faster than others. Also, it is good because harder debate for the 2AT is better. 1, 2 in our checks, and also reasonability. It doesn't rise to the threshold of rejecting the team. Just throw out the counterplan. Now, the case page, there is no possible way that they solve all of their grand liberalism arguments. They say they're a starting point, but a starting point to what? What strategy would emerge from our questioning of the way that death operates that would be sufficient to overcome the vested interest that their Giroux evidence says exists for the liberal order, like the elites controlling politics, the industrial complex, etc. It is totally nonsensical to suggest that they would be able to do this. Our Majwa evidence says you should not give them credit for solving something just because they have criticized something that misunderstands the way that the relationship between ideas and materiality actually works, and actually is counterproductive because it distracts us from forming praxis in ways to actually challenge those issues. And ways to actually challenge those issues, there is no possible way that they would be sufficient to spill over to changing environmental policies to solve the dissad, or changing the way that our prison industrial complex or our international policy works to cause war. Those things do not happen because of PAS, and it is disproven by the fact that Oregon and Washington and other countries in the EU have already gotten rid of PAS. Like, they assert that 2 states isn't a sufficient threshold, but like, why? And we rethought the relationship, and also there are whole countries in Europe that have legalized PAS, and they are still liberalist, which disproves the veracity of the link. Now, the extinction impact, it could be true that people trapped in hospitals could benefit from dying, but other people still have other positive values, like the fact that they have experienced happiness. They've also considered future generations. There will be future lives that will be valuable and are worth preserving.
Agreed. 1 second, we haven't started it yet. Actually, guys, we got these 8th graders turning 9th graders that flew out from Vegas, right, to come to our camp 2 years ago.
counterplan.
Put the counterplan at the bottom, so I can check this out.
Case DA.
That's not a case on the news.
Case to set count,
Yes.
and the counterplan is not the word. For the substance.
Word pick, where was that?
I typed in word pick. I was like, I wasn't quite sure what was going on here, and because they didn't name their argument.
That's right, I have a state counterplan we're on right now, so
Yeah, sorry about that.
it's cute. Just name your arcs.
Alright. So we're good.
If you don't think there's net benefits of counterplan, it means you vote half on presumption. If we win, the case is able to solve for autoimmunity, it means that we're able to solve the structural cause of environmental destruction, which means that only confronting the fear of the other that is rooted in the law is able to, that only confronting the root of the other that is, only confronting the fear of the other that is rooted in the law is able to provide the kinds of strategies necessary to be able to challenge environmental destruction in general. Is able to, environmental destruction in general. Go to the line by line. They say that we're not able to solve the AF. Again, they have mischaracterized the frame. They have misunderstood our framing of the AF. We are not just simply you pass the bill, therefore it happens, which is why Oregon and Washington are not sufficient. Our argument is that in this particular round, the imagining of the plan is something that is necessarily good because it causes us to reflect on the larger contradictions within the law that legalizing PAS at a national scale would necessarily call into question, which means you do not sever our justifications from the plan and the larger rhetorical criticism of the law that is in the 1AC from the passage of the plan. This is not just simply post-plan the deconstruction. It's we are tying our advocacy for the plan to our larger criticism of the law, which means that they have completely misunderstood our solvency for the entirety of the plan. They say we never provide specific strategies. Yes, we do. The piece of Giroux evidence highlights several. The piece of Giroux evidence highlights several instances of autoimmunity that we specifically are able to oppose uniquely. Things like financial deregulation, environmental destruction, increased militarism and police violence and war. These are all things that we necessarily take a stance against, and necessarily taking a stance against those things is the starting point for ever being able to formulate strategies in the instance of things like environmental destruction. I think that we have a unique inroad to that because the only reason that environmental destruction is able to take place in the first place is because we necessarily see the environment as an object and be manipulated freely by a liberal subject. That is something that has been the analysis we've given to 2AC and 1R that I don't think they have a very specific response to, which means that only we are able to solve the precondition of structural violence, which means that only the affirmative is able to solve for the larger structure that caused things like the Great Lakes to things like the pollution of the Great Lakes to happen. Because the only reason we can say that will allow that pollution to happen is because we simply do not care about the environment, which means case is able to solve for the DA, and there's no case is able to solve for the DA. They say that ideas are not necessarily lead to practice. I think that was answered by my analysis of Giroux evidence that was done above. It also answers their sufficient spillover claim because it's not just a matter of particularly passing the plan, it's a matter of a larger criticism that justifies the plan. They say extinction first. Again, we're able to solve for extinction. That was the structural claim above. Again, they have conceded that they have conceded that autoimmunity is the structural precondition for any kind of violence. That is not a root cause claim. It means that for the possibility for their impact to ever take place, there has to be larger structure of fear of the other, in which the other particularly is seen as meaningless. Not only are we necessarily afraid of it, but the other is also seen as meaningless. Therefore, that is what justifies violence to be done against the other in the first place. This is what justifies things like environmental destruction, because the environment is not seen as something that is meaningful in itself. It's just seen as an object to be manipulated by a subject for strategic use purposes. Again, this is a precondition for violence, which means the case solves the necessary structure that causes the impact of the DA to happen, which means the case solves the impact of the DA. Or the DA. Look, I don't think there's an impact of the DA. I don't think there's necessarily an impact of the DA. Michigan alone is not sufficient to be able to solve, because they're going to be power plants that are located around the entirety of the Great Lakes. They are not going to be able to solve for. Their modeling argument is their modeling argument is nowhere near specific enough to their adoption of coal. Is not specific at all to coal. Also, I think the link extension is very, very light in the 2NR, which is something that you should hold them to. They have no reason why the legalization of PAS specifically caused the kinds of defections which would derail the energy bill that's going through the that's in the Michigan government right now. Their only argument is that there is significant. The only link argument extends that there is significant opposition to the bill, but that is only amongst the constituency. They have not read any specific evidence to the House, and they have not read any specific evidence to the particular people who are going to pass that bill or who are pushing for that bill now, and why that causes a split amongst the GO, and why that causes a specific split amongst the GOP GOP in the House. All of their argument is just specific to the Republican Democratic Party writ large, which means there's a very high link differential between the AF and the plan that you should between the AF and the plan that you should hold them to, that I think makes a very low risk of the DA. The next argument is that the status quo is currently able to solve. They have conceded that their only uniqueness evidence concedes that they are moving away and making pushes to move away from coal in the status quo right now, which means that if worst case scenario, even the specific bill they're talking about gets moved, the larger push away from coal is sufficient to be able to should be sufficient to solve the long term for their terminal impact. The fact that 70% of the people want that to happen, and they have not read an argument as to why PS necessarily switches that. Even if we have taken out of context, the larger support for something like moving away from coal should be sufficient to solve in the long run, even if this one particular bill is not necessarily enough. And go to the counterplan.
Oh, they also say constituencies affect how policies are made. If constituencies affect them.
Yeah, they say constituencies affect how policies are made. If that's true, then I know that 70% evidence isn't taken out of context, because it says that 70% of the people want the bill, and they have not read a single piece of evidence specific. 70% of the people want the bill. They have not read a single piece of evidence to why PS is significant to be able to cause that threshold to go over that, or why it is enough to switch the entire constituency away from a desire for energy. If anything, this causes, at best, they have one that there might be a mild fight in the House. That is not a reason why they have not won a connection between PAS and energy policy, which is a huge link differential which means that you should probably go to counterplan. Permutation resolves 100% of the offense. They have not one that there is a unique impact on DA that the status quo is not solving for, which means the links to the DA are irrelevant. They have conceded our framing of presumption. They have to win that there is a unique DA to the affirmative. If they do not do that, solvency for the counterplan is irrelevant. You should default affirmative offense defense paradigm is irrelevant because it assumes that they have won a link to an argument that is not resolved by the status quo. They have to win a substantial difference between the initiatives and the status quo are not sufficient different from the initiative they are talking about. They haven't done that, which means even if they want to link to the DA is irrelevant. How the permutation functions besides the perm probably causes simultaneous legalization, which is sufficient to be able to take blame off the government.